In the late summer of 1973, a graduate student is living alone in an off-campus apartment, taking summer classes to get ahead. She's well known on campus, the kind of person who's involved in everything. She's also a gifted musician with a lot going for her. After a day spent socializing, her night ends with a short walk home, which should have been just a 60-foot stroll across her apartment courtyard. But by the next day, no one can get in touch with her. That evening, a friend goes to check on her apartment and walks into a nightmare. Tess had been the victim of a violent homicide. Over the years, the case has moved in different directions. There have been some leads that have seemed promising at the time, but definitive answers have stayed out of reach. For decades, her murder has stayed with this small college town, and for nearly 15 years, one former classmate has been working to keep her story in front of people, hoping someone will finally come forward with information. I'm your host, Megan, and each week on A Simpler Time True Crime, I cover older unsolved cases and challenge the idea that a simpler time meant a safer time. This week, I'm bringing to you the unsolved murder of Tess Hilt. Before we get into the episode today, I want to acknowledge that in addition to all the original source material over the years, I also heavily visited the Justice for Tess Facebook and blog page. And the Facebook and blog page, that's run by Michael Holmes, and he partnered regularly with Alice DeSterler from Defrosting Cold Cases. And collectively, they have spoken with original people involved in the case. They connected with Tess's mom several years ago. And in putting out information about Tess's case, they've been able to bring in hundreds of tips to turn over to modern day investigators. And they've been able to take a lot of all of the different conversation that's out there from people who lived in the area at the time and put a lot of it together, put it into timelines. And it's a really helpful website, and I encourage you to check it out. So I wanted to highlight that first, and I linked them in the show notes. Just as a content warning, this case has some pretty graphic details, and I will get into some of them at times. As you'll see when I tell it, there's a lot of debate in this case as to whether this crime was perpetrated by a man or a woman, and the details speak to this a lot. Beyond just the graphic nature of her wounds and injuries, there is discussion of sexual assault as well, so please take care when listening. And with that, let's get into it. Teresa Sue Hilt was born on January 6, 1951 in Chillicothe, Missouri, a town of about 9,000 people. It's a place with a pretty unique claim to fame. It's known as the birthplace of sliced bread, the origin of that phrase we still use today, the best thing since sliced bread. Teresa went by Tess, and that's how I'm going to refer to her for the remainder of this episode. She was the only child of her parents. Her father, Stanley, was a Missouri Highway Department worker, and her mother, Mildred, was a realtor. Tess was bold and vivacious in spirit, and she had a small stature. Her mom would recall how tiny she was at birth, and that didn't change much over the years. Even as she grew into adulthood, she was barely 5 feet tall. But she made up for it with her big personality. She was the type of kid who, as they got into high school, she was involved in everything, but she took a special interest in music and theater and was just an absolutely gifted musician. Tess graduated high school in 1969 and then went on to attend school at Northwest Missouri State University in Maryville, Missouri. That's a college town of similar size to her hometown, and it was roughly an hour and 45-minute drive. So it was far enough away that Tess was able to get some independence and go away and live on campus, but close enough that she could come back and visit her parents. While she was attending college, she was involved in everything just like she was in high school. She did plays, music, musicals, the yearbook committee, Greek life, the marching band, the student union. The list went on and on. She took part in any of the musicals and plays on campus, and in her senior year, she had starred as Peppermint Patty in You're a Good Man, Charlie Brown. It was said she had so many social obligations that she would keep a notepad on her door for people to leave messages for her while she was away. Tess had obtained her undergraduate degree in elementary and secondary education with a major in music, and that was in 1973. At this point, she was 22 years old. That summer, she decided to stay in the area and get a head start on her master's degree by taking some summer classes. Her plan was to earn that degree in guidance and counseling. The summer semester was set to wrap up in the middle of August, and then she'd have just a short break until the fall semester, something she was already pre-registered for. On the afternoon of Saturday, August 4th, 1973, Tess had plans to hang out with a guy named Ed Happel. Tess had lived at the College Garden Apartments alone in a basement apartment for about 2 months, and Ed also lived in that complex in another building. They had actually hung out the night before, and in certain accounts you'll hear that maybe they were kind of dating, but if they were just sort of heading in that direction. It was very early. Otherwise, a lot of articles just refer to them as friends. So Ed had tried calling Tess during the day on that Saturday, and there had been no answer. So when he got off of work, he went over to her place to see what was up, and that was at about 5 p.m. They were supposed to be hanging out again that night. So, of course, she's not answering, and when he knocks at the door, she still didn't answer. It's unclear whether the door was open or if he could he just push it or if it was just unlocked, but either way, he said it was uncharacteristically unlocked, and he was easily able to enter her apartment. He called out for her, and then he made his way to her bedroom. In there, he found an absolutely horrible scene. Tess was nude. The bedding was all over the room, but the sheet was kind of tucked over her. Her head was tilted to the side, and she was face down. He tapped on her foot, hoping this was all just a misunderstanding and she was going to wake up, but her foot was cold. Ed called for help and waited for authorities to arrive. It was clear that Tess was dead and had been for at least a little while. As the scene was examined closer, it told the story of a horrific and brutal attack. Tess had a nylon stocking still knotted around her neck. There were stab wounds to her chest and lower abdomen, and bruising on her left cheek and arm indicated she was likely trying to defend herself and was struck. She also had stab wounds to her arm. The apartment itself showed no signs of forced entry, and the small one-bedroom unit didn't have any signs of a struggle really either. So to clarify though, Tess and the state of her body, that indicated that she put up a fight, but it didn't look like it spilled out into all parts of the apartment. Not only that, the apartment looked neat and cleaned up, almost too neat, like someone had spent some time there after the murder and cleaned up the apartment. The dean of students called Mr. and Mrs. Hilt and relayed the news. He actually spoke with Mr. Hilt, but Mrs. Hilt picked up the second phone and listened in, and she nearly fainted from the news. And these poor parents, I just cannot even imagine receiving that phone call. As Tess's body was taken away, police wanted to talk to those closest to her, as well as people in the community and her immediate neighbors. From the get-go, this case struggled with some jurisdictional aspects because there was local, county, and state investigators pulled in. And that may sound promising because it's more resources, but it wasn't really organized like a task force, and there were struggles over who had the authority in what area, who was doing what. People were kind of tripping over one another. When it came to who was in charge of investigating the case, there were a few early names that came up. One was John Fraze. He was the prosecuting attorney for Nottoway County at the time. Then there was John Middleton. He was the sheriff of Nottoway County. And then Sergeant James Rhodes. He was from the Missouri State Highway Patrol. As police spoke to neighbors, they found out that nobody had heard or seen anything unusual overnight. No screams, nobody coming or going from the apartment, nothing. The house here, the housing rather, was your typical off-campus housing, nothing fancy, paper-thin walls. Some of the early investigators actually put the sound to the test. They stood in adjacent apartments, yelling and then just talking at conversational tone, and they said you could hear everything. So that was just something interesting that they kind of filed away in their brains about, if this brutal attack is happening, how did nobody hear? After interviewing several friends and classmates, investigators were able to piece together the day leading up to her death. So on that Friday, she had spent the afternoon helping Ed Happel paint his apartment, Unit 96. The two then left his apartment to attend a gathering that evening at a nearby trailer. There was some discrepancies about how much Tess drank that night. One person said she had maybe a drink, but Ed actually said she had a few rum drinks. Tess wasn't known to overall be a very big drinker. She was social, she went out, but she kind of nursed the same drink all night. According to Ed, they left the party sometime around 11 to go back to his apartment and hang out. They were just going to watch some TV and listen to music, and then a couple of Ed's friends stopped by shortly thereafter. One of the men, someone named Terry, left at around 12:15 a.m. The other man, someone named Gary, he left an hour later at 1:15 a.m. Ed then reported that Tess left his apartment at 2 a.m. He told authorities that everything was normal. He described their time alone as romantic and kind of flirtatious, but he said they did not have any sexual interaction that night. This apartment complex had kind of a U shape to it, and Tess would have just had to walk about 60 feet across a courtyard, picture the middle of the U, and that's all she would have to do to get back to her apartment from Ed's, and hers was Unit 26. It's a little hard to picture, so I'll have a photo of this on our Instagram at SimplerTimeCrimePod. The photo is from an old newspaper clipping, and it's old and grainy, but it will give you the general idea, and I think it's helpful. Now, personally, I find it odd that at this hour of the night, Ed didn't walk Tess back to her unit, but apparently he didn't. And it was said there were a couple of parties happening that night, and that one was actually at the picnic table in that courtyard, but nobody said they saw her walk back. Now, one thing I'll say about that is that a later investigator would share that he interviewed a man who had left that party in the courtyard at 1:30, and he was one of the last ones to leave. And the detective, strangely enough, used it as like see, this guy was there and he didn't see anything. But the timeline that the detective had established, Tess hadn't walked back to her apartment until 2 a.m. So if that guy left at 1:30, he shouldn't have seen her. And I don't know. Some parties do go that late. Of course, 2 a.m. is a very regular time for parties to still be happening, but it's not all that surprising to me that in this really short walk across the courtyard, nobody saw her. How many times have I done cases on here? Think about Jason Jolkowski just a couple of weeks ago. That was broad daylight that he just vanished in the middle of the day and nobody saw anything. No one saw him get in a car. Nobody saw him go into a house. And that was in the middle of a day on a busy city sidewalk. So for me to find it far-fetched that no one saw her at 2 a.m. walking across 60 feet of a courtyard, that's not all that surprising to me. As I mentioned, Tess lived in a basement unit, which those are notoriously dangerous for these types of crimes and typically why they are the cheapest types of units in a complex. And that's because a lot of the times there is easy ground level window access. This case didn't seem to indicate that. The point of entry to the apartment was the front door, which detectives said was a type of door that would have been easy enough to break down if someone wanted to, but it hadn't been. So of course, that always brings up the classic debate of, did Tess let someone in? Did she open her door willingly, or was her door just unlocked? Ed said that it would have been unusual for her to have her door unlocked, but you never know if maybe she just hadn't locked it and someone had been mostly right behind her and she just hadn't gotten around to locking it yet. And she was known to let people in pretty willingly. She was always trying to make her space available, help people, let people crash if need be. So, was it somebody she knew? We don't know. What we do know is that after this event, many people who hadn't been previously locking their doors, which was a large amount. They were all getting interviewed, and all these women in particular were saying, well, I hadn't locked my doors before, but I am now. So let me remind you all to not forget to lock your doors. That's one of my soapbox things. In talking with others, detectives learned early on some concerning incidents that had been happening in the community. The first was that one woman in the weeks leading up, she had been followed by a man repeatedly, and she felt this person had been in her apartment and moved things. She did not know who this man was, just as she had seen him following her around. She had actually alerted law enforcement to this, and they had done a stakeout, but they never did catch the person. Number 2, and it's unclear if the person in number 2 is the same as the person in number 1, but there were reports of another lingering man, or possibly the same one, around the apartment complex, one who tried to gain entry into one of the buildings on the complex by using a ruse of collecting a vacuum cleaner he had loaned out, and it sounds like he was able to breach part of the building, but not an actual apartment. And I don't actually know how they were alerted to this situation, but that was another story that was out there early on. And then, of course, after this, police did just start getting more calls because the residents of the community, especially women, they were spooked by this. And so they started getting more prowler calls. It's hard to say, were there actually prowlers out there? Were there just situations where women were more quick to report things that they'd brushed off before, they'd been creeped out, but they just brushed it off? It's hard to say. And probably a combination of the two. Before we get into the autopsy findings, let's first review again how she was found, because this kind of leads into it. So Tess was completely nude on her stomach. Her hands were found almost like they had been tied behind her back, but there was nothing holding them there anymore. There were marks on her wrists, though, that would indicate that she had been tied up during the commission of the crime. Later on, it would be determined that it was most likely shoelaces, and those were no longer at the scene. A paring knife with a 4-inch blade was placed in her right hand, and a sheet had been neatly tucked up around her body, and the bedding was otherwise kind of all over the place. There was an immediate post-mortem examination completed, but the actual conclusive findings and the report being released, that took several weeks because of a planned vacation by the person who conducted it. It was found that Tess had been stabbed several times, including in the lower abdominal area. And just a PSA, this next part is sexually graphic, but she had stabbing and slashing injuries to her genital areas. They also determined this occurred while she was still alive. She was strangled with her own nylon stockings, and those were still found knotted around her neck. But the fatal injury was the stab wound directly to her heart. The autopsy findings showed that the killer had likely moved the knife around, creating additional wounds. Some sources say 8 additional wounds without fully pulling out the knife. So the killer would kind of start to pull it out and just push it back in. The paring knife was found in her hand, and that was from her own kitchen. Tess had clumps of what was thought to be her own blonde hair in her mouth, and that it had gone down into her esophagus. She also had torn neck muscles, a black left eye, bruises on her upper arm and left cheek. It was just absolutely violent and a seemingly rage-filled personal attack. It was also noted in the autopsy that it was believed that she was stabbed in the heart first and that the strangulation took place secondary to that. As far as the sexual assault goes, that came back inconclusive. Investigators back in 1973 reported that Tess had not had sexual intercourse that night or ever prior to that night. I'm not sure exactly what made them determine that, but a lot of the ways that people would determine a history of sexual activity back then are not the ways we would draw that conclusion now. So as I talk about this in 2026, do I necessarily buy this completely? No. But it's also totally possible that she was not sexually active. Either way, there was no semen collected from the examination, and they were quick to say that just because they couldn't conclusively determine that she had been sexually assaulted, the same went for the opposite. They couldn't say conclusively that she wasn't either. The knife was collected to be sent off to the lab for any fingerprints, and other items were collected as well, like bedding, a bloodstained napkin, and things like her notebook of names and phone numbers. In those early days, investigators interviewed people both to learn more about Tess and to learn about how people close to her moved in and around the time of her murder. They went through that book of names and phone numbers I just mentioned, and they tried to track down all her contacts. What made it tough was that summer class let out a week after her murder, and then many of the students weren't on campus anymore. This became a recurring issue as people moved out of the apartment complex altogether. But over the course of those first weeks and months, they did interview roughly 200 people. They collected fingerprints of 150 people, and they administered polygraph exams to 6 people, one of which was Ed, and all 6 people passed the polygraph and indicated they had no knowledge or involvement in Tess's case. A $1,000 reward was initially offered, and then that was built upon, in large part because of Tess's parents, and they took a unique approach. You know how you usually give to a reward fund and you sort of give up that money knowing you did a good thing, and that's that. Well, in a hope to increase donations, they actually said they were tracking them, and that if nothing came of the case in a year and the perpetrator wasn't found, they were going to give the money back. But they felt that the high amount was important, and it took time, but they did eventually grow it to over $3,000 in the first year or so. It was pretty early on that Tess's case deviated from cases similar, and that's because in these cases, by default, a murder like this you'd think was committed by a man. But as early as August 14th, those working the case said they couldn't rule out it was a woman, and that belief would carry some additional weight with a viable theory later on. So we'll get back to that in a bit. Now, on August 13th of 73, just 9 days after Tess's murder, another young girl by the name of Karen Jones was murdered in her apartment. She was just 16 years old and the mother of a 2-month-old infant daughter. Her and her 19-year-old husband had split a month prior, and her daughter was in the custody of her meaning Karen's dad and stepmother. Karen had only been living in this new apartment for 2 nights when someone attacked her in the apartment, stabbed, and strangled her. There were enough similarities that people were wondering if it was the same perpetrator, though it actually was the exact opposite order. In this case with Karen, she was strangled first and then stabbed. Also, unlike Tess's case, Karen's case had early suspects and an arrest within just a few days. A local 21-year-old military man whom Karen was acquainted with was ultimately arrested, charged, and convicted for her murder. And there were no other ties to Tess. Not to mention, the geographic distance of these 2 cases was pretty substantial, so it was a little far-fetched from the beginning. On August 16th, Sergeant Rhodes had a cryptic message to the media. When asked about suspects, he said they were investigating and working overtime locally, but that it gets complicated when people who need to be interviewed leave town. That was an interesting statement to make because, of course, who are these people eluding the conversation with law enforcement? Then, the following day, he released that police were interested in speaking to a man who was about 6 feet tall, 185 pounds, greasy black hair combed straight back, and he said that the person may be driving a late model Pontiac Grand Prix or Chevy Monte Carlo type with an Iowa license plate, and that it was possibly white over gold in color or just gold. Shortly after this is when law enforcement gets into a bit of a feud with a local TV station out of St. Joseph, Missouri. And that's because the TV station aired a recording Tess had recorded of herself, and in it she talks about a man with greasy slicked hair who had his hands all over her and wouldn't leave her alone. It was part of a series of interviews and conversations she had recorded as part of her large thesis paper, which she was doing on drug and alcohol addiction. So the first part of the feud was who had access to the recording, how it ended up at the news station, and then police said they were trying to downplay the potential significance of this greasy-haired guy. They didn't even think it was the same person, the one in her recording versus the one that had been seen around the apartment complex that they were looking for. And so at this point, the greasy-haired guy gets brought up in an interview, and one of the detectives says, "I don't want to hear about it anymore." Law enforcement accused the news station of editing that clip in a way to sound like he was saying that in response to Tess's case, basically making it sound like he's saying, "I'm sick of it. I don't want to hear about Tess's case anymore." And he was saying, no, it was only about this slicked back hair guy. It was clear at this point that everyone was getting frustrated. Tess's family hired an attorney to help privately investigate because they felt the police weren't doing enough, but that person couldn't bring any more light to the case. Police felt they were getting inundated with information that was irrelevant, and it was just this constant battle of sorting out what was relevant, what wasn't, what was useless, what might actually be a break in the case. So everything was kind of a mess. And at around the 6-week mark of the investigation, a Maryville police sergeant was promoted to detective as a result of grant funding, and he was assigned as a special investigator to work the Tess Hilt case full-time, and then he was positioned to be able to help out with neighboring county investigations as needed. His name was Sergeant Bill Wright, and he was a 32-year-old with 8 years of experience on the job. And he had the fun job of trying to piece together the work of 3 separate agencies. But he worked the case hard, sometimes 16-hour days. Unfortunately, for months, the case got quiet in the media, though never out of the mind of scared residents of the small college community. In late January of 1974, just after what would have been Tess's 23rd birthday and almost to the 6-month mark of the investigation, Sergeant Wright shared his thoughts on the case, and he had 3 aspects he felt pretty confident in. 1, he firmly believed the killer was a woman. 2, he believed the murder took place in Tess's apartment. And 3, he believed that she did not just leave Ed's apartment and go straight back to hers. Rather than try to paraphrase his line of thinking, I'm going to share a few direct quotes he gave to the St. Joseph News Press. As far as what he thinks she did, if not walk the 60 feet to her apartment at 2 a.m., he shared this, quote, "I don't think she went directly to her apartment. My surmise is that she met someone and may have gone with them, perhaps in a car or maybe walked someplace. Someone may have grabbed her. Some travel checks which belonged to her were found in the parking lot adjoining the south side of the south apartment building. Then her billfold was found near the railroad track south of the complex. I think she was brought back or went back to her apartment where the murder took place. The murderer could have been someone she knew because no one heard any outcry, and these apartment walls are paper thin." End quote. Now, that news about the traveler's checks and wallet being discarded, that was brand new. Some who talk about this case think that indicates it was a stranger who then just discarded things, but others believe it was likely someone close to her or someone within that complex who was trying to throw off investigators. Now, here's what he said about why he thinks it was a woman. Quote, "Everything was so neat. The place had been cleaned after what must have been quite a struggle. Blood was generally wiped away. It was even wiped partially from the paring knife, which was apparently used in the murder. There were still spots of blood in such places as the light switch and on part of the wall. It was just too neat a job to have been done by a man." End quote. Now, he lost me at that part. I get the cliche, men are slobs, blah, 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 but there are definitely meticulously neat men out there, and also none of this matters because the apartment was cleaned up and tidied up to cover up a crime scene. This has no indication that this person who committed this was some award-winning housekeeper in their personal life. They are literally just trying to not get caught for a crime they just committed. He then went back to talk about her virginity and how that eliminated the idea of a man having done this because there was no sexual intercourse, no ejaculation. And I mean, nowadays we just know better. We know these are not mutually exclusive things. Obviously, if there had been foreign male DNA present there, that would change the course of the investigation, but it not being there does not eliminate men from committing this crime. In this interview, he said he had bounced this case off of many investigators and that a seasoned detective out of Kansas City had told him this was going to be a telephone case, meaning that somewhere the killer was listed in that telephone log that she had of all the people's names and phone numbers. But up to that point, he had really tracked that down and not had luck. Also, remember the greasy-haired guy? Well, he said they were able to track that person down, but he was an out-of-state teacher in town for a summer seminar, and nothing about his presence was related to the crime. At around the 6-month mark, investigators asked Dr. Milton Halpern to review Tess's case findings and give his opinion. And this was huge. Milton Halpern was one of the most influential forensic pathologists of the 20th century. He served as New York City's chief medical examiner from the 1950s into the early 70s, right around the time this case was unfolding. He's really known for helping move forensic work into a more modern scientific space, and at a time when there was a lot of death investigations that were still pretty basic, he pushed for more thorough autopsies, better documentation, and closer coordination with law enforcement. He was involved in a number of major cases. Just to give some examples, one of the reasons Milton Halpern was so well known is because of how often his autopsies changed the direction of cases. In one example, a man claimed he shot his father in self-defense during an argument, but Halpern's examination showed something totally different. He was able to prove that the father had actually been shot through the abdomen and that the bullet had ricocheted, meaning the wound in the back wasn't an entry wound at all. That completely undercut the son's version of events, and that's just one example. He was also known for determining in some cases that a single bullet had caused multiple wounds, something that wasn't always obvious at the time. So he reviewed the Tess Hilt case, and he had a different take on some evidence detectives had found, and that was hair evidence. There was the hair found in Tess's mouth, which was thought to be her own. At least that's how it was reported early on. But in addition to that hair, there was some hair found next to her body. Dr. Halpern thought that the hair found indicated that the suspect may have a rare hair condition called monolithics. At the time, even dermatologists thought it had to do with being unkempt or dirty, which is what some of the articles then go on to say from back in 74. But we now know it's a genetic condition, often occurring in people from South America. And instead of being smooth, each strand of hair has a beaded or uneven appearance with weak points along the shaft. Because of that, the hair breaks very easily and often looks short, sparse, or brittle. Apparently, it's a noticeable condition, but despite this, nobody in their pool of people they were talking to really stood out as having this disorder. Another thing that came up in the first year of that investigation, several months in, there was one person who law enforcement sort of shamed in the paper without naming, and they said that this person had refused a polygraph. They didn't say whether this was a man or a woman. They just said that this was a student and that they had declined the polygraph because they said they were too busy and it was going to take too much time. And law enforcement told the paper to them this meant one of 4 possible scenarios. Scenario 1, the person doesn't know anything and doesn't want to give up the necessary time to take the test. 2, that person knows something about the victim, but not about the murder and doesn't want to become involved. 3, the person was not involved in the crime, but has information about the crime and does not wish to divulge it. Or 4, the person was directly or indirectly involved in the crime. In the paper, police say they don't want to name the person because they don't want to embarrass somebody who was not involved. They're just hoping this person will change their mind and cooperate. And they said that they gave the reasons for requesting the test to the student, so they had been transparent. According to the Tess Hilt webpage, tips over the years have really led them to believe that this was a female subject and the person who comes up as a potential person involved over the years. The next lead in the case wouldn't come until February of 75, when a person wrote to the paper and asked if Tess Hilt's case was connected to another homicide from May of 74. and up to this point, investigators hadn't put the cases together. In this case, another young woman with ties to the same area was killed. Her name was Helen Hansen, and she had previously attended Northwest Missouri State. On the night of her murder, she had been out socializing, spending time at some local bars before heading home, and after leaving, she was attacked and stabbed multiple times, and her body was found alongside what I think to be the road. It was hard to tell from the old newspaper articles, but she was found at this intersection near her sister's house, which she had been walking to. The connection to Tess stood out. It was believed that the two women knew each other. They definitely attended college at the same time, and both had been out the night before being killed, and they were killed in a similar way. The similarities raised concern at the time, but despite that, the cases were never officially linked, and both remain unsolved. After this, Tess's case haunts the area, but reporting on it largely falls off the radar for decades. That was until the early 2010s, when a former classmate of hers Googles her case to find out who did kill Tess Hilt, only to find out that the case had never been solved. So this is where Michael Holmes comes in, the person I mentioned at the top of this episode. He runs the Tess Hilt website and the Facebook page, and he's made it his mission to help find her killer ever since he found out that her case was still unsolved. His interest in the case and the case updates were featured prominently in a 2012 article in the Kansas City Star. By this point, Tess's father had passed away some 16 years prior in his 70s, but her mother was still alive. She lived in fear, asking the papers to not even use her full name because she was so worried about her daughter's killer still being out there. She had a big security system, and she regularly stopped into the police department to learn about any new sex offenders who may be in her area. The loss of her only child, her sweet Tess, had just wrecked her, and when she found out that Michael was bringing new attention to her case and a space to share tips, she was really happy. At this point, the case was in the hands of Maryville Director of Public Safety Keith Wood, and he was not new to the case. He had taken over the investigation 16 years in. And the first and biggest disappointing thing of all is that all the evidence has been lost. There are a few different possibilities. This part was not in the paper, but it was on the Justice for Tess page. Michael Holmes had heard that there was some mishap with a fire truck and flooding that had led to damaged evidence, and that ultimately a lot of Tess's evidence was lost to that. But in the official interview with the paper, Keith Wood says it's possible it was misfiled or lost with departmental moves, or that because there were 3 different departments handling it at the beginning of the case, that maybe one has some and doesn't realize the other has it. So if by some miracle that evidence is still out there and not degraded or damaged, that could solve this case. And of course, we hold out that hope. Wood essentially had to rebuild the entire case because the original police file was also missing. So they had certain copies of what was sent off for further testing or reports that had been maybe sent to the FBI, but he had to piece it together. It was just a total mess. And he admitted that the standards were not the same then as they are now, and there's just different best practices. So he's done with it what he can. In the early 90s, Wood reached out to the FBI for a profile in the case. FBI profilers offered a few different possibilities when it came to Tess's killer, but none were definitive. One theory was that the attacker was a man who may have misread a social interaction as flirting, and then became angry when it wasn't reciprocated and escalated to violence. This seemed to be their top theory. But they also didn't rule out the possibility that the killer could have been a woman. One reason for that was the condition of the scene. We already kind of talked about the scene being cleaned up, and that was something that the FBI latched onto as well. Some also felt that the level of care or staging wasn't typical of a male offender, but we've obviously seen a lot over the years where that's not the case. The profilers kind of debated over the wounds and could a woman even carry out that kind of attack? And in the end, even the profilers acknowledged there just wasn't a clear answer on this. It remained a case where multiple possibilities existed, but none could be confirmed. As we wind down this episode, I want to go through a few of the names and figures and theories that have come up through the investigation, mainly of the tips that have come in through the Tess Hilt website and Facebook page. And they have spent so much time putting the pieces together to try to make some sense. So a lot of these are just scenarios or possible people, but I'm not going to overly name people because this is still in open and active investigation, and a lot of it is speculation. So one, in the last few months of her life, Tess had told several friends about an older male she was involved with, but she never did use his name. Some said she described him and that she was in love with him. Others felt she may have been a little afraid of him. There's also reason to believe he may have been married or going through a divorce. Now, some speculate this was a person who worked at the college and had been involved with the production of one of the musicals she was in. This man and his wife ended up leaving town shortly after the murder, and decades later, this man did die by suicide while he was living in Europe. Number 2, and this is a guy I will name and use his real name because he's a convicted killer. This is a guy named Michael. He went by Mickey Sperano. He attended the college at the same time as her, and he also looked a bit like someone who was seen out and about around the complex at the time and in the local bar scenes that Tess may have been a part of. He went on to violently murder his mother just a few years after Tess's murder. It has some similarities in violence and methodology-wise to Tess's murder. And it should be known that, Tess was friendly, as I mentioned. She would frequently have visitors. She'd let people crash there. So it's unclear how much she may have known this person. But nothing that directly ties him to her case, just he looked like some of the witness descriptions of people that had been around in those weeks leading up, and he's obviously a convicted killer. And the other major one is the jealous wife/girlfriend angle. This one's kind of a placeholder. It could be multiple different people. It could be the person involved with the older man, or it could be a woman who was involved with someone who maybe this man had a crush on Tess, but this woman was obsessed with this man or dating this man. And this seems to be the theory that's most leaned into nowadays, that a woman was filled with rage and jealous of Tess because either she had something that, Tess had something that this woman wanted, or there was some sort of love triangle. It should be noted that most of the people who are centered in the rumors of this case are now deceased. But Michael Holmes is aware of the true identity of the woman who could be the jealous girlfriend. And that's because they got several tips about her. And my understanding is she actually had some interface with the website and or the social media pages early on regarding Tess Hilt. And she made some interesting comments. People who were there in Maryville at the time of the murder say this girl made threatening comments to other girls at college, and she had made some weird statements following Tess's murder. And that woman is still alive. Ed Happel died in 2020. Tess's mother died in 2016. And it may seem far-fetched that this case still has a chance at resolution this many years later, but that's what we do keep seeing. So we can hope that in the absence of locating the evidence, that would be a total game changer. But that, if not, that the person who did this or someone who knows, someone who that person confided in, that now they come forward and do the right thing. I highly recommend you do a deeper dive than I could do in this episode alone by visiting the Tess Hilt page. It has pictures, old articles, and you can really see a timeline of Michael piecing this case together, brick by brick, with the help of people coming forward and sharing in the memories of Tess. If you have any information on the unsolved murder of Tess Hilt, please contact the City of Maryville Police Department at 660-562-3209. This has been another episode of A Simpler Time True Crime. If you appreciate the work I'm doing, please leave a 5-star review on your preferred listening platform. If you're over on Apple, leave a few words. That helps tremendously, and word of mouth in general is just so helpful. If you wish to support the show monetarily, I have my Spreaker Supporters Club, where you can listen ad-free while you are in the app or on the website logged into your Spreaker page. You can find that at the bottom of the show notes. Case suggestions can be sent to simplertimecrimepod@gmail.com. I also have an Instagram, simplertimecrimepod, and that's where I post all the weekly pictures, and you can DM me on that. As always, thank you so much for listening, and tune in next Monday.